Okay, welcome back to our talk titled Darwin or Design: What Biology Reveals About the Secrets of Life. Let's take a few follow-up questions before we start part two.
The question is, science, they don't accept all of those data, pure data. Therefore, is it more of philosophy now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. Science is as much about philosophy as it is about data, is what I was trying to make that point before. And what we don't realize is that we're governed by a philosophy. We're usually a product of our times. And unless you're aware of your lens, you're not going to rethink things. You're not really going to be an innovative thinker. You're just going to make new discoveries on a horizontal level. You may add a new little twist to the theory of evolution with your new discovery. But you're not really progressing thought. It's not an expansion of thought, as we say. It's just horizontal knowledge. All of the great thoughts really have been thought of, if you think about it. I mean, we're living in an age today that is a product of ancient Greek thought. Okay, the Middle Ages were a time of darkness, lack of innovation. They were basically characterized by Platonic thinking, Platonic dualism, where matter was evil, and only the spiritual realm was good. However you defined your spiritual realm, could have been your mystery religions. So in other words, the natural world was not a worthy realm of pursuit. And then Thomas Aquinas came along in around the 12th century, and he really reconciled philosophy with theology. That matter was worthy of study, that matter was not evil, which is kind of what the Bible said all along anyway. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Creation is good. But the world needed to reconcile that with their philosophy, and Thomas Aquinas did that. Effectively, the results of which launched the world on a spree of progress that has not slowed since. We eventually had the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution. Now we have the technological revolution and so on today. But all of this is because we're studying the natural world. And this is what Aristotle said. Aristotle thought the natural world was not evil, whereas Plato thought it was. And so we're really basically in an Aristotelian rubric. And scientists think they are thinking up new things because they're studying something that matter, but they're really not advancing thought. Nothing's new has been thought of, basically. There's nothing new anymore, really. We're just kind of going on horizontal knowledge with our science. This is why it baffles me, because Stephen Hawking said something not long ago. I saw in an interview. He said, "The scientific account is complete. Theology is unnecessary." This is what he said. I thought to myself, you got to be kidding me. The scientific account is complete? Every time we see a new discovery in human evolution, it throws the whole theory into chaos. Really? That's complete? There's so much. We know just a micron of what all there is to know in the universe. And so on. That's to say nothing of the metaphysical realm. So it is about philosophy. I thought of this one time. This is interesting. We had a well-developed metaphysic before the age of science. In other words, all these great philosophies of the ancient Greeks descended down through the philosophy of the Middle Ages and then Aquinas. And let's just say, if it were possible, that order was reversed, that we had the age of science preceding the great metaphysical philosophies of the ages. What kind of world would we have? We'd have a world of chaos. It would be uninhabitable. But I don't think it would have been possible because this very scientific method is based on great philosophy. So in that real sense, there's another argument that Christianity is at the core of Western thought, because it was the great Thomas Aquinas that reconciled philosophy with theology. And so a real argument can be presented that Christianity is at the core of Western thought. If Western thought is at the core of progress in the world today, Christianity is at the core of Western thought. Maybe that answered your question somewhere in there. Did you say you had a question on Galileo, would you say?
Well, I just wondered that he was, the church was condemning him, and he figured out that, the world was revolving around the sun, but they thought the sun was revolving around
Right.
the earth.
Copernicus, right.
Yeah.
Copernicus revolution, right.
But he was right.
He was right. It's true. And a lot of times atheistic scientists will point this out to say that the church was wrong. But again, first of all, it was a Catholic church. Truth is always interior. And science is just another way of affirming truth. Okay? You don't determine truth. You discover it. And that's what true Christianity is all about. We don't determine our own truth. We assent to it. We discover it. We call revelation propositional truth. Okay? These are just first things. And we assent to that. So,
one thing I would like to know, though, how do they, when they find these skeletons of dinosaurs and so forth, how do they, on the year stuff, if you start right as the Bible starts, how do they develop?
the ages, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, the ages come from a lot of different avenues. Okay, and all of these different avenues kind of contribute to the theory of long age in evolutionary thinking, and some Christians who believe in old age, old Earth. But it comes from a lot of angles. It comes from uranium-238 dating of rocks and other argon dating. Okay, the half-life. It has to do with the theory of the half-life. What it takes for elements to lose half their atoms, how many years that takes. Now, there is an assumption there, because they assume that rate has always been constant throughout time. What we see today happened in the past. But it comes from other angles. I mean, they look at ice cores. They go back a certain amount of years. Coming from astronomy.
Radiation.
It's what we call distant starlight. How long it takes for light to travel, from a star. So it comes from all these different angles, and so they determine these ages from that. It comes from luminescence dating in rocks, which is actually less accurate. So it's coming from a lot of angles, but the truth of the matter is a lot of those there's so many false readings that you never really hear about. And that's what I always am concerned about, is what we call the file drawer effect. In other words, if it's an aberrant reading, you tend not to hear about it. But if it agrees with preconceived dating, it affirms it. But there's a lot of aberrant readings that just get stuffed in the file drawer. So only if it's affirmed, and that's the problem, is these readings. You get it in carbon-14 dating with newer specimens, you get it with uranium-238, and so on. So, good question.
So what is the carbon-14 dating? What is that?
Carbon-14 dates organic materials. Uranium-238 dates rocks, inorganic. Right, and that's what usually used in anthropology. Carbon-14, it only goes back, I don't remember the half-life, maybe it's like 5,200 years, something like that. I can't remember what carbon-14 is, but I did know it one time. Anyway, part 2. There was once a conference of some of the world's best scientists that convened. And they were sitting around this big round table. And they were talking amongst themselves. And they said, one guy says, we've come a long way. We've cloned animals. We've cloned sheep. We've even cloned human now. The other guy says, yeah, you're right. I don't think we need God. Everybody's sort of affirming, yeah, we don't need God. One other guy chimes in and says, you know what? Why don't we go elect somebody, one of our scientists, and challenge God to a man-making contest? That's what we'll do. We'll challenge him. They all said, yeah, they all put in their vote. Yeah, we agree. So they elected one of the representatives, one of the scientists, and he went up on this tall hill somewhere, and he said to God, we've done amazing things in science now. We've cloned animals, we've cloned sheep, and so on, and now we've even cloned a human being. We don't think we need you anymore. We would like to challenge you to a man-making contest. We would like to challenge you to a man-making contest. We don't need you anymore. And God looked down and said, oh, okay, you want a man-making contest? Sure, let's go. Bring it on. So the scientist bends down, reaches down to get a clump of dirt. And God says, you get your own dirt. And that's the major problem of evolution, is they just put it down the pipeline. They pass the buck. They ultimately cannot explain where things come from. They cannot adequately answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there something? Now, they try with chemical evolution, and we will save that for another discussion. So, let's get into this topic called irreducible complexity. Another strike against macroevolution and a vote in favor of design is irreducible complexity. This is where the tall tale of macroevolution crumbles. Because macroevolutionary theory requires major changes in the animal kingdom, which are theorized to occur, the descent of which all organisms can be traced back to a universal ancestor. But biologists have observed in biological systems something called irreducible complexity. Irreducible, not just complexity. It's got to be irreducible. This is where molecular machines in the life of the cell appear with as much complexity as needed to function. Just as much as it needs to function. Each part is core to the operation of the system. Contrary to evolutionary requirements, they don't develop incrementally. And they don't steal functions from other systems to produce a new system. Molecular biologist Michael Behe defines irreducible complexity like this. A single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of those parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. An irreducibly complex system cannot be produced by slight successive modifications of a precursor system, because any precursor is non-functional. Remember the premise. Everything has to be functional for the moment. It's utilitarian. There's no forward-looking dynamic in evolution. This is a powerful challenge to Darwinian evolution, he says. Now, it's worth noting that there are more and more biologists affirming the arguments for irreducible complexity and stepping away from Darwinism since Michael Behe's book was published in 1996, called Darwin's Black Box. And that refutes what I told you in the beginning. Jerry Coyne, that evolutionary biologist, he said, everybody affirms the claims, the major claims of evolution. But there's no evidence that organisms develop slowly through indirect pathways. Nor were they modified with descent in some increasingly complex fashion. Rather, boom, they're just there. Integrated and tight-fitting functions. Biological systems have layers of hierarchy. A popular word picture to illustrate this would be a mousetrap. Think of a mousetrap. All of the parts must be pertinent and present for the system to work. Each part is formed for that system. Take one part away, and the mousetrap cannot function. The same for biological systems in a cell. It's the very exact same thing. All parts just appear. The major components of the eye, for example, must all be present to function. From a utilitarian perspective, what's the use of half an eye? Darwinian natural selection is an instant gratification feature where current functionality is necessary for the theory to work. It's a current gratification system related to utilitarian. But what was the function of the parts of the eye in the gradual evolution of the eye before any use was discerned? Here's the problem. No detailed pathways are ever presented. And they call this a fact? They're saying this is established fact? Really? Sounds more like science fiction. Now, if we think in terms of full-fledged organisms, okay, let's get outside of biological systems in a cell, real small. Let's think big, full-fledged organism. We get what are known as complete adaptation packages. These are complete adaptation packages, right? That is, animals just appear ready to go. The giraffe, let's take the giraffe as a very, very good example. Darwin thought the long neck adapted to the utility of eating leaves on high trees. That's what he thought. But the problem becomes now how to get blood to the giraffe's head. So we have this long neck, but the heart. Well, you need a strong heart now. But then with a strong heart, how does the giraffe drink? When it bends down, the blood vessels in the neck and the head would burst. A graduated, modified with descent structure would never have arrived because a function that enables survival also aids its extinction. Fortunately, the giraffe is equipped all at once with a strong heart to get blood to the head, pressure sensors in the neck to monitor and signal when that pressure is too great so it can stop drinking before the blood vessels burst. All of these systems appear together, just like the mousetrap example on a biological level, micro level. They had to co-occur at once in complete adaptation packages, not adopt cumulative changes over time. And this is a major problem for Darwinists. Here's what one expert says. A functionally integrated system consists of parts that are tightly adapted to each other. Tightly adapted. Remove one part of the core and you cannot recover the system's basic function. So instead of bottom-up evolution as assumed by modification with descent, the giraffe evidences top-down design with the package deal of irreducible complexity. Top-down design. Now, perhaps the premier biomolecular example for irreducible complexity is the famous bacterial flagellum. The flagellum is an irreducibly complex protein machine that has a whip-like tail, and it propels the bacteria through its watery environment. It is basically a rotary motor with the same characteristics of motors that human engineers designed. It has a propeller. It has a rotor. It has a stator. It has bushings. It has O-rings, a drive shaft. It has mounting discs, and it also has a hook joint. The tail rotates bidirectionally at extremely fast speeds. And according to Harvard biologist Howard Berg, is the most efficient machine in the universe. The tail averages 20,000 RPMs. Up to 100,000 RPMs it can go to, and it can change directions in a quarter of a turn. The flagellum is absolutely necessary if it's going to get the food it needs to survive. and it requires 50 proteins ordered in the correct sequence. The absence of any one of these core parts would result in a complete loss of motor function. Simultaneous construction is mandatory. Now, this is perhaps the most amazing thing about this, is the similarity of biological machines compared to our man-made ones. When man invented the motor over 100 years ago, he didn't even have the natural blueprints that underwrite nature because the electron microscope wasn't invented. Yet man's invention of the mechanical preceded the discovery of the natural with great consistency of design. The natural pre-existing the human from the beginning. Now, is that coincidence? I don't think so. Design is seen at all levels, even in biology. Now, of course, Darwinists are not without reply to this, quote, problem of irreducible complexity. They propose a concept called co-option. Okay, this is the label, to support gradual Darwinian pathways of descent. Now, co-option is where parts from a previously targeted system break free and they are co-opted into a new novel system. In other words, parts sort of drift off. They're borrowed and utilized for a new system. Sounds good if you have an undisciplined imagination. But is really co-option an option? There are a host of problems with this fabrication of the evidence. First, how could one thing evolve from one function and be totally coordinated for another function? Co-option stacks up coincidence upon coincidence. It's like picking out parts at Radio Shack and hoping you have everything necessary to build a computer. It's like taking a bolt from a car and hoping it'll fit a washer from an airplane to make a motor for a lawnmower. What we see with precise biological systems is each part is specifically tailored for its own system. You cannot add a component and then make it indispensable to the original system. You can't have it both ways. It is impossible to graft parts into an evolving structure whose very function is co-evolving with the structure. Let me say that again. It is impossible to graft parts into an evolving structure whose very function is co-evolving with the structure. There would be interfering cross reactions with other proteins, right? Again, for unguided chance-based mechanisms, what is the forward-looking dynamic for all the parts of a bacterial flagellum working in another system to spontaneously break free and form a new tightly coordinated system? What is that forward-looking dynamic? It's impossible from random processes. Science is about the best explanation of the data, and Darwinists never provide complete, detailed evolutionary pathways. I think we can say firmly that co-option is not an option. Now, there's another issue here. If you think on a bigger level, on a philosophical level, right? Darwinism leads to what we call a fallacy of composition, where the entities are the outgrowth of their own processes. What is a fallacy of composition? A fallacy of composition is like saying, since the stool is made of wood, that the stool is wood, right? See that stool there? But there's something more about the stool than just wood. There's something about the stool that makes it stoolness. Or because a house is made of bricks, the house is a brick. No, it's not. There's something more than just the bricks. It combines into something. There is something about the final product that is not reducible to its material components. With organisms, mechanisms cannot account for the origin of mechanisms. Mechanisms cannot account for the origin of mechanisms. Machines cannot produce what it means to be alive. Machine-like aspects of organisms may be observable, but it doesn't mean the organism is a machine. Now, we're not arguing that nature doesn't contribute some elements for life. What we're saying is that nature does not have what it takes within itself to produce life. The power and capacity. Something else is required in conjunction with nature to produce life that supersedes life. Natural causes never produce things ex nihilo. They only rework things ex nihilo, out of nothing. The rifts between the inorganic and organic worlds are so great too great to be determined purely by natural forces, the inorganic and the organic world. Life itself does not contain the answers to the questions of its own existence. Darwinists never really answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And naturalism is where Darwinists argue in a circle. They presuppose the thing they are trying to establish as the conclusion. Their answer is built into the premise. Darwinism has to be assumed in order to be explained. Life cannot be an outgrowth of its own medium. The sum of the parts is never greater than the whole or its cause. A closed system of chance does not have within it the power nor forward-looking capacity to produce life. There is something more to life that is interior to life, yet existent with life. Our insistence on naturalism as all of reality has skewed our view of reality. Now, there is evidence in Darwin's writings that if Darwin knew what we know today, he probably never would have propounded his theory to the world. Yet those who hold to Darwinism express their closed system naturalism with the appearance of some intellectual rationale. Okay? Darwinism sounds intellectual. But molecular biology is supposed to be a precise discipline. But scientists settle for conceivability instead of actuality. The pathways that Darwinists propose for the origin of life are so general that they're similar to fairy tales or historical novels. Facts are sprinkled between a large matrix of verbiage and fanciful drama. One man said, the pathways of descent that Darwinists put forth are like trying to run from California to Japan with only one stop in Hawaii. Or it's like trying to connect the dots on a circle with only 3 points. And then they say that's evolution, that's fact. There's just too much missing. One scientist observes this. He says, there are no detailed Darwinian accounts for the evolution of any fundamental biochemical or cellular systems, only a variety of wishful speculations. Evolutionary biology has not even come close to solving the problem of complexity of tightly integrated biological systems. Nature can produce patterns, but it cannot produce information. It's a fabrication to claim that material mechanisms solve the problem. I will close with a quote from William Dembski. He challenges the evolutionists when he says this: show us detailed, testable models for the origin of life, the origin of the genetic code, the origin of biomacromolecules, assemblages like the ribosome, the origin of molecular machines like the bacterial flagellum, and intelligent design will die a quick death. So I assume after all that, there's got to be a few more questions. One thing somebody asked me earlier is the idea of God consistent with science? And I would say absolutely consistent. You know the whole scientific method is going from the known to the unknown. And what we see in nature is extremely consistent with the idea of a designer. Because if you have a designer, he cannot be co-involved with the process. He has to be transcendent. So we have enough evidence for the designer without the designer being found in the microscope itself. So it's perfectly consistent with the designer. You go from the known to the unknown, and you make deductions. All of science is like that. Okay? So, anybody else have any other questions? Or
Question.
yeah, sure.
About co-option.
Co-option. Okay.
Yes, because according to it's a gradual
Yeah.
parts drifting off or borrowed
Right.
system.
Right.
So if it's acceptable in the science community, how they, I wonder how do they relate to a gender specific, like male and female, in order
Right.
for reproduction to
Yeah.
happen?
Yeah. That's a whole nother realm. Reproduction is a major problem for evolutionary theory. Because not only if you had to get one organism just right, with just right actions at just right times, with just right co-options over millions of years and many organisms, then you had to have another type within the same species where you could reproduce. I mean, it's just too many amazing, beyond imaginary coincidences that have to come into play. There's just no way. Somebody asked me earlier too about fossils. You know, the idea of gradualism is a tenet of evolution, where you just see this unbroken chain link of varied organisms, and they have to be present in the fossil record. Well, good gravy. I mean, we've had 150 years since Darwin. We've gone down miles below the Earth's crust. We've broken over every rock, every quartz, even quartz crystals, to find any evidence of these transitions. And there's nothing. All we ever see in the fossil record is what the Bible affirmed all along. Is things were formed according to their kind, and they stay according to their kind. Let's just take an example from their own premise. The Cambrian explosion, the great Cambrian explosion, right? Happened 550 million years ago, supposedly, right? Well, over 90%, 95% of the known phyla, okay, you have kingdom, phyla, class, order, family, genus, species. Phyla. 95% of the phyla are found in the Cambrian explosion. These are pretty sophisticated fossils. They lasted for 5 to 10 million years, as they say. And then they're gone. There's no pathways. There's no of descent to these organisms. They just explode onto the scene. They stay, which is called stasis, and then they're gone. This is very consistent with the biblical model.
So what caused that to them to just stop? Do they have a big meter hit the surface?
Yeah, there's different theories on that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, some kind of environmental pressures of some kind, perhaps. You know, I mean, again, even that's not at odds with the idea of a designer. A designer would probably employ a physical mechanism because we're physical. Creatures are physical. So, you know, the Cambrian explosion, there's just no explanation. Here's another thing. Is the earliest organisms are found are single cell with a nucleus. But cells with a nucleus are more sophisticated than cells without a nucleus. But the earliest that are found are with a nucleus. So if evolution is true, where you go from the simple to the complex, you would expect to find the earliest cells without a nucleus. But that's not what we find in the fossil record. So again, you can use their facts to refute them. Okay? Anybody else? Questions or? Any other questions? Okay, sure.
Does science have confirmed any gradual link pertaining to?
No, there's not one, not even one gradual link. That's the point. I mean, you'd have to have all of these. You'd think you'd have millions of trial and errors, stops and starts, dead ends. There's none. Now, Stephen Jay Gould, the famous Harvard biologist, recognized this problem. You know, he's no longer here, but he recognized this problem, and it was a major. He even acknowledged this is one of the major fatal errors to our theory. Then he proposed this idea of what they call punctuated equilibrium. So he acknowledges this explosion, this suddenness in the fossil record of organisms, and they stay, and then they're just gone. But what he proposed is that the transitional links between these organisms was relatively short, maybe a few thousand years. All these experimental models, and then you had the ones that just stayed, that were fully functional formed. And so we don't have a record of that because there's not enough time, right? But that doesn't seem to fly. No, there's no evidence. But punctuated equilibrium is the big term that they use. But there's no evidence for it. Again, this is just speculation. But again, a theory has to be based on fact. And they say this is fact, but there's no evidence. So how do you say this is a fact? Right? You can't. You can't say that, but the science books say that. It's disingenuous. But I think, like the reasons we said before, I think once you allow for a designer, then you will open the door to maybe God. And we live in a culture that does not want to have God because there is a moral implication. And it becomes a heart issue, not just a head issue anymore. Right? So, and I think that's kind of where we're at. And so they just sort of stay in the system. And what happens is these people, you know, you get accolades. I mean, it's just sort of this closed system where you just keep revolving thoughts and your premise and your assumptions, and hopefully somebody gets a new idea, incorporates it into the theory. Everybody gets accolades. They get a paycheck from this. But if you really break out of it, and you're really on an honest pursuit of truth, you'll lose your career. Where are you going to go? Where are you going to get money? How are you going to make a living? And so there's sort of this inertia that takes place within, and you stay in this thing. You know, centrifugal force keeps you in it. That's part of it. But honestly, a lot more scientists are coming and breaking free. I mean, look at the University of New York. A professor of philosophy wrote a book a couple years ago called Mind and Cosmos, Why Evolution is Most Certainly Wrong. I think it's the title. And even him now is coming along and saying, you know, and I read the book, and he does still affirm the basic evolutionary mechanisms, but he thinks mind is somehow at the center of creation, somehow mind. But he's using mind in an Eastern religion sense of monism, where mind is everything, kind of in a pantheistic way, but it's still Eastern religion. So, is that all the questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm gonna go sometime.
Okay, well, thanks for coming, folks. I appreciate it. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.